Robert Reuben, Managing Director of Proceed Group, provides some fascinating insights into the legacy problem, how many companies struggle to understand the various interdependencies of their existing IT infrastructure, applications and data, at a significant financial and operational cost to the business, and proving a potentially significant obstacle to upgrading and optimizing their IT environment for the demands of the digital age. Robert explains that it doesn't need to be this way.
Okay, so a good place to start, I guess, would be if you can summarize as best as possible the current issue around legacy systems, legacy data. You know, what kind of a problem is it posing many or most organizations?
Sure, Phil. So it's an interesting area because we've been talking to customers about this for quite a long time. Okay, and in the past, they might have had some organizations would have one or two legacy systems. Maybe they're doing an upgrade to something newer. They're going to start with a greenfield migration, start with a new system, and then they've got the old system still there. And what do they do with that? But we find some organizations, even not that large organizations, have grown by acquisition, and they might have something quite surprising, like 40 or 50 legacy systems in one quite small organization. And again, in the past, some have not seen that as too big an issue. You know, typically they're running these things in their own data centers. You know, it's something that's not the top of the priority list. But now, as more and more customers are moving to cloud, maybe SAP customers are moving to S/4HANA or some sort of RISE deal with SAP, then it's becoming more and more of an issue. Now, the costs are getting more and more expensive. There's compliance things to think about. And the other thing we observe is that when people are looking to move to cloud, for example, it's very hard to bring some of these legacy systems across. So it's a real blocker to some of these new capabilities. So really, it's become a much more significant problem than it ever was in the past. And the numbers can go into 6-7 figure numbers very quickly if you're not careful.
And in terms of, I think you alluded there to one of the major challenges, I guess, is the sheer quantity and potential complexity of migrating large, if they've inherited or acquired lots of legacy infrastructure over time. But is that the main one, or are there other, what are the main obstacles other than that, or including that, to someone going, hey, why don't we just move to some modern, applications infrastructure and do away with all our legacy kit and data?
It's a good point. And I think, first of all, as I alluded to before, it's not always been seen as a priority in the past, right? And now the fact that the costs are getting a lot more significant with cloud, it's starting to become a priority. Often people just didn't know what to do about this as well. Okay, so we talk to organizations where they think they know they need to keep the data, and we could talk a lot more about why people need to keep the data. But we can just put all the data in our favorite data lake, but actually things like that are a real problem. They just don't work doing it that way. So people just don't know what to do, and it's not been a priority. But we see those things changing now. We're educating a lot of other partners we've got, and we talk to a lot of customers. But it is something that's seen as more of an unknown area. Everyone's focusing on the new, the exciting. AI this week is the buzzword. But what do you do with this legacy stuff? It's not been something that people have focused on so much, and that's really the root of it all.
And in terms of, is there a moment in time? Is it when they look at the annual IT bill? I don't know. Think, wow, we're paying all this money to keep all these systems going, and we're not sure what we've got. Or the fact that they can't access some of the data very easily, or they're aware it's a single point of failure. So, if that system goes down, then they're in serious trouble. What is it that people suddenly sit up and go, wow, okay, we've got all this legacy infrastructure data. We need to do something. Otherwise, we are paying too much. We're vulnerable. What goes through people's minds, if you like?
There's a couple of things we see. One is definitely any sort of move to cloud. Okay, when you look at across your estate and work out if you're going to take all these terabytes of data into the new world, and it's legacy data, again, we can come back to why people need to keep this data, but that suddenly becomes very expensive, particularly if you're taking the whole application with it, and there's probably a lot of data in there that you don't actually need. So moving to cloud, or and with that, it can be things like moving to S/4HANA or moving in the SAP world to RISE. Sometimes the cost of doing that, taking all that data to one of the hyperscalers, can literally block you from doing that move. It's just too much. So that's a real point where people get forced to address it. The other one is, you're right, people can sometimes just be looking at the overall costs. And equally, sometimes they get to the point where they've got real issues because of the legacy systems. Right? So sometimes people might have moved some of this onto more modern hardware or virtualized it, and then they're starting to mitigate some of the issues that they've got. But if you're running on really old kit in your data center, typically an old application is still running on old operating systems and databases. The whole stack is getting to be out of date, and you can't change the stack because the dependencies all the way up and down, right? Then you're getting to the point we have customers who say, this is a 20-year-old system. We're actually quite scared to turn it on, right? Because they know it's not supported, it's not getting security updates, and it's quite an exposure for them. Right?
And I'm just wondering as well, I mean, increasingly sustainability is on a lot of companies. I mean, is that a reason for or even against? I mean, do some people say, oh, it's much more sustainable if we just leave alone and don't invest in new kit because of whatever reason? Or do they conversely think, well, it's very expensive and old-fashioned, probably consuming a lot of energy, so we'd be much better upgrading to better and more energy efficient infrastructure? I mean, does that cross anyone's mind, or is that not really high on the priority list?
It is. I mean, people often are focusing on cost and the kind of whole compliance area. There's a lot of different areas of compliance around this, but sustainability is certainly an angle that's coming up more and more in conversations. So particularly those people are still running on these applications in their own data center, on the original hardware. I mean, if you look back and it's a 20-year-old system, we know every time some vendor brings out a new server or a new piece of storage, there's going to be that incremental, probably 30% improvement in whatever the right metric is every couple of years. You multiply that over several generations, and the cost of running on really, really old equipment is pretty substantial, both in terms of direct cost, how much space it's taking in the data center, how many racks full, when we know on more modern equipment, it could be shrunk right down, and power usage is going to be significantly higher than if it was on modern infrastructure. So it's becoming definitely much more part of the conversation. And by moving that data to something more modern, you would make pretty significant savings.
Okay, and you've referenced the data and why people keep it a couple of times, and I suspect most people know that the majority, if not all organizations, are terrified of pressing the delete button, and then the next day the MD wants just what they deleted, and it's like, how do we tell him? Or but fundamentally, what are the issues around? There's obviously, there are compliance pieces and stuff like that, but are people too terrified of pressing the delete, or at least moving data to a more suitable environment, whether it's tape, long-term archive, as opposed to sort of primary storage is expensive? Just what do you see, I suppose, when you talk to customers, as to how well or not they are managing their data?
It's interesting. You see a few different angles. I mean, there's definitely organizations that have there's still a mentality we've got to keep everything, right? And there's advantages to keeping everything. We might want to go and, as you say, look up that particular piece of data, or be doing some analytics across it. Some have got into a world now where they understand, probably through GDPR, that you need to be thinking about your rationale for keeping data and how long you keep that data. But really, they need to be looking at, across all the data they've got, what are the requirements? And there'll be some business reasons why you keep data, but often there might be some reasons where you're, for audit or legal, or a regulator might require you to keep data for certain amounts of time. So typically, we're dealing with financial data in the UK or the EU. You need to keep it for 7 years. But we're dealing with, if you're dealing with a regulated industry, someone who's making pharmaceuticals, or they're designing a nuclear power plant or an aircraft engine, they might be keeping that for 50 years or longer, right? And again, it varies by country. So in China, there's effectively a law that says it's 100 years, or effectively you might keep it forever. So it varies a lot, and the organization's got to have a good view across countries, different types of data, how long they need to keep the data. And then there are some where they positively want to delete older data because they don't need to keep it, or they think there's some sort of liability with keeping it, and others are taking more of an approach of wanting to keep it. But there's definitely reasons why you need to keep the data for at least typically 7 years. So with legacy systems, it's kind of obvious to say that you don't want to just go and turn them off and throw them away. You've got to keep the data, and then it's the question of, do we keep the legacy system, or do we do something else?
Okay, and yourselves, Proceed Group, are you the company or one of the companies that helps people? We discussed obviously a lot of the issues around legacy infrastructure, legacy data. Is it your role to facilitate people, so you go in there, sort of understand their current environment or help them understand it if they don't understand it, and then make recommendations, help them migrate, retire, decommission, whatever it is? Is that your sweet spot?
It is, and we started from as an organisation, we've been going for just over 20 years. We started with more of a focus on archiving of live systems. So typically, large ERP systems, our initial focus is very much SAP. Organizations over the last 20 years, the systems have grown and grown and grown, and the typical story where historically it was the core transactional data, but over time there's more and more data from IoT devices and more and more sources. So exponential growth in data. So archiving is a real focus for us, but increasingly over, say, the last 10 to 15 years, this discussion about legacy data and what do we do. So very much we try and be very consultative and be very helpful. We've done a lot of these projects now. So what are things to think about? What are the gotchas? It's like anything else. You need to make sure you've got the business bought into doing something about this. But we try to be very helpful. And if people want us to come and, first of all, assess what benefits they could get from doing some sort of change in this area, we can help with that. And then if they want us to come and do a project, yes, we can help with that. But the starting point is very much, understand the challenge, understand the options they've got. Because we've seen a lot of these projects, we can say, okay, there are different approaches you could take, and here's some of the pros and cons.
Okay, so in terms of that process, you say, so it starts with the discovery. I mean, do you find when you engage with companies, at least most of them do know what infrastructure they've got and what data they've got and where those two, what sits where, or are you sometimes surprised that people don't even know the basics of, well, that server over there, we haven't switched it off for 10 years, we're not quite sure what it does, therefore we don't switch it off. I mean, what levels of knowledge or not do you encounter?
There is a spectrum, you're right. And sometimes, generally people understand the applications that they've got out there. When you get into the next level of detail, okay, how much data? Is that one 100 gig or is it 10 terabytes? Even those kind of questions, sometimes people need to go away and ask and check those kind of things. So you get to a point where some have got very high level view, some have got a lot more detail, but then it's a discussion of, okay, we've got this list of systems, what are the options?
And I'm just wondering as well, being slightly mischievous, I mean, virtualization has obviously done a large amount of great things for people, but is it also in this case a bit of a bad thing to have, because it disguises, you put this layer in, abstract layer that therefore to a certain extent people don't really care or know what goes on underneath, because they just know it's all virtualized, and therefore if they need some storage or something, it arrives, but they don't necessarily understand the plumbing, if you like, underneath. Is that an issue or not?
I think there's an issue there in the sense that people think that's a solution to this problem, okay? And it's a partial solution, okay? So we've seen people that have virtualized everything, so you get away from all the issues of really old hardware, right? You've still got the really old software stack, which might be challenging to virtualize or move to the cloud, but you're getting away from the really old hardware piece. And equally, some people have started to move things to the cloud already to kind of lift and shift the whole legacy stack, which can be quite challenging. And then you've always got options in the various hyperscalers to put things to sleep, to kind of suspend these old workloads, and think that's a good enough approach. You've really still got some challenges there where you're still running on this stack of old software, potentially not supported, potentially not getting security updates. You've still got to think about, do you want to be paying maintenance on all of this old software? And we find some vendors are charging a lot of money for supporting old applications. And again, you get into organizations, very large organizations, and some of these things, it's on somebody else's budget, or they're not adding up the total cost to cost because it's multiple people's budgets. But the total cost of keeping some of these things, even in that kind of virtualized way, can be very, very high. So that's why we think there are better ways of doing it than just keeping virtualizing it, keeping it suspended or whatever, and actually just making sure you keep the data you need. And that's the really important piece.
So in terms of the steps, I mean, do you have a sort of certain steps. I say obviously the first thing is discovery or measurement, however you want to quantify that. So at least you understand the extent of the problem, and from that you can extrapolate potential options. Are you able to decommission legacy? You recommend archiving, maybe even acquiring some new infrastructure that's going to work, as you say, much more efficiently. What's the, I guess, the spectrum of options that people potentially have to understand? Obviously cloud you mentioned as well, so yeah, a whole range of things they have to understand. How do you guide them through that, if that's not an unfair question?
No, that's fine. I mean, it's I think you've alluded to this already, that there's definitely a step at the beginning of understand a couple of things. When you understand what you've got. So what, if you look across your IT estate, where have you got legacy systems with legacy data? Clearly you've got plans. You're going to be, over the next 3-5 years, you're going to be taking some systems you use now, and you're either going to be migrating to the future, or you might be starting something new, and then you're creating more legacy systems. So what's the map of what you've got? What are the applications? What versions are they? How much data is in each of them? Are they today on-prem or cloud? There's a measurement, assessment, mapping piece to do. When you've worked that out, then you also want to be thinking back about, okay, for the data I've got, what are the requirements? Do I need to keep it for this many years? How do I need to report on it, and so on? Because typically the beauty of keeping a legacy application going is you've got all the options of how you can access and report on that data, but we've got the downsides as well. And then moving to some new solution, you've got to make sure you've got ways, you understand the different options for how you're going to go and access the data. So I'd say, you've got the whole kind of measurement piece first of all. Then you really want to understand your options, and we can advise on that. There's different ways of dealing with these kinds of systems, but how can you get to a point where you're just keeping the data you need, but still making it available to your users in suitably friendly ways. Okay, you don't want to end up with a situation where you've got several thousand tables of data sitting there, and you're saying to a finance user, well, there it is. They need to be able to go and see, a sales report or a set of accounts, not thousands of tables. So it's really kind of measure, understand the options, then you can go and do some sort of archiving project and keep the data you need. And then at the end of all that, then the organization can go and decommission, turn things off, get rid of the hardware. And we see quite a few that are talking about a data center exit. Now, so if they're going for an all-out cloud strategy, what's holding you back? You might have a set of legacy applications in your data center. When you finally dealt with them, kept the data you need, then you can go and turn the lights out and save all those costs as well.
Okay, and I know quite often customers are reluctant to sign up to, admit to what they were doing because they're perhaps embarrassed of what they were. And even though you've then got, they've admitted it and you've gone in and helped, but are you able to share, whether you're allowed to, reference companies or just more generally ways in which you've helped certain customers, from the legacy problem they've had to something much more, should we say, fit for today's digital age?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a number of these projects, as we said. So recently we've done one with an organization called Dutch Rail. So the main rail operator, the national rail operator in the Netherlands, who also own a lot of franchises across the UK and elsewhere. So they were hard hit in COVID with massive passenger numbers declines, massive revenue reduction, so real need to focus on cost. So they had a number of legacy SAP systems. So again, it's a scenario where that wasn't ever the top of the priority list. Suddenly with the cost focus, they thought they needed to do something about it. So we helped them with the first 2 applications, used in that case some SAP software so they could use that to keep the data that they needed, get rid of those legacy applications and make major savings in the cost of keeping those applications in place, ongoing maintenance, people costs associated with them, all of it. And now we're going to go and move on to do some more. A much larger scale one we did several years ago was with one of the big pharma companies. Again, they'd grown partly by acquisition, partly the nature of their business. They've been through many complex upgrades, so they had a large number of systems. We went, first of all, they had about 20 large SAP systems that we were able to help them keep the data. They could then decommission those. Pleased with the way it went. They then had 55 JD Edwards systems that we followed on the project. And as part of it, we did a couple of things. One was we showed them an approach we call the factory method, where you're really industrializing the approach on these large scale projects. So you might have a team where some people are focused on extracting the data, Some are focused on working with the business to understand the requirements. Some are focused on creating the reports that are needed. And at the end of it, they can then go and turn off all of these systems. And as part of it, we did a lot of knowledge transfer. So their in-house team could then go and then tackle many more systems themselves. So there's a whole spectrum of these kinds of projects, different technologies, but we find that the benefits are usually very attractive.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of where people start, often the recommendation is to pick a little area, do that and that. But with this, you potentially do need to understand the end goal, because obviously if you only do bits and pieces, you might find out that you've got a slightly disjointed solution that doesn't necessarily take you where you need to be. So to folks looking at this or starting to implement it, or what do you recommend? What are the steps to take so that they don't make a complete sort of Horlicks of it because they haven't understood where they want to end up?
There needs to be an IT view of, okay, where are we today? Where are we going? So they can work out what they got today that's legacy, and what will become a legacy over time, and what are they going to do with it? So, mapping where they are today is a big piece that we normally find they're on top of anyway. And then we will work with them. Okay, what are the options, and what are the drivers for doing it? So it's really important to understand. Do they have some? Sometimes we're dealing with people that have got a reason to shut down a data center, and there's a deadline for doing so. And if they achieve that deadline, then they're going to make major savings. If they have to carry on paying for it for another year, that's a big cost. So understanding those kinds of deadlines, understanding their sustainability objectives is again important. So what are their reasons for doing it really helps inform the approach. Okay, and then we can take them through the different approaches that are open to them and how they want to go forward.
Okay, and maybe to finish this perhaps slightly miserable, I mean, the NHS, for example, in the UK is held up as the most sort of legacy ridden organization. Would organize, I mean, someone, I don't know who runs that, but is that, everyone kind of thinks it's insoluble, but do you think even an organization like that with so many disparate systems that have been acquired and built up over such a long time, is it still possible for them to sort of, an organization like that, to over a period of time address that legacy problem, or is it sometimes you just have to say it's too embedded in organizations, so we can't move forward? Just thoughts, if you've got anything.
No, I don't think so.
Not big on the NHS, but just an organization like that. If you see,
you've got to have the organization's got to have a view across their landscape of how things are interconnected and what integration points there are and how the data flows. Right? Typically, in these kind of projects, we're dealing with legacy systems where we can do it on a piece-by-piece basis. So you can go and slice it up, salami slice it, and attack. Okay, let's look at a certain area. Are we going to go and look at systems in a particular department or a particular type of system? But the result of it is, if we do this kind of project, that they will end up with, say, a new software platform that might be still on-prem if they want that, or it could be in the cloud, where they can go and access the data that they need. Okay, and typically these have got integration points, so they can still be integrated into the wider landscape if they want. But you can do it in a kind of piece-by-piece basis. You've got to have a way where you can go around these very large problems and slice it and dice it and find a way to take things forward. The benefits are too compelling to just say we'll leave it as it is.
Okay, I think that's answered most of my questions, and I'm very grateful for your time. So enjoy chatting to you. Thanks very much indeed, Robert. Thank you.
Great. Thank you too.